Two legions were lost to the tides of history. Their stories erased, their warriors forgotten, but their Primarchs? Myths whispered into the darkest corners of the Imperium. How do you make a Primarch that doesn't exist? For this build of a Primarch, we are going to be starting with a known base of a Primarch, Rabute Guilliman. And for the first area to start is the centerpiece of the model, which is the crutch and the hips. So, glue these together and let's get working on the legs. Now, the largest issue with using Guilliman is getting rid of the overly excessive gilding. This is going to require a lot of sanding, grinding, slicing, and buffing to get the areas nice and smooth. Don't forget to use some Tamiya glue to smooth over the area. This process is done for both legs, the groin and the back. Once we are ready, glue everything together and smooth out any transitions and remove all of the mould lines. The next part is to tackle the chest, and to do so we'll build the torso as normal. This is now going to give us our strong, stable centre part for the model. Just before we attach the chest, we need to attach the piece which comes from the lion's kit, and this is the neck armour guard. So some cutting, some fettling, and this will fit into place. The chest is going to get the same treatment as the rest of the model, so grind and buff all of the gilding off of the chest piece. With that all cleared and glued on, we can now start looking at adding some depth to the shape. So, mixing up some green stuff and milliput in a 50-50 mix, we can now add this to the chest and start to shape the chest smoothly into the rest of the armour. To help with the sculpting, I'll use Vaseline on the sculpting tools to help get a nice smooth finish and transition. Now, you don't need to be perfect with the amount that you add. It's easy enough to remove or start over. You can just cut, scrape, and we can start again to get back to work. Once the epoxy has set, I'll start to then sand the chest to get a nice peak on the centre pieces. With the chest now ready, it's time to deal with the rest of the armour panels. And you guessed it, it's going to be some more sanding, scraping, smoothing, gluing, checking, sanding, grinding, cutting, smoothing. With the torso now mostly there, the next part is quite graphic, because we're going to cut it in half. Next, we will add a chunk of green stuff in between the pieces and add a belt band around the cut torso to give us our extension on the torso. With the green stuff cured, we will then cut the edges to get a nice sharp edge and then sand the top layers to get a smooth finish. With the armour panels done, we will cut out the original shoulders and attach these to the model. Make sure to cut the arms off and leave a clean, flat surface so we can make some new arms. Now, for the right arm, there isn't anything we could use from any of the kits that should give me the pose that I wanted to go for. So, I use brass tubes instead. One size for the upper arm, another for the lower, and then the final rod to fill the void. The pieces were glued together, bent, and then cut to size, leaving us with a crooked arm. I'll then use the arm guard from the lion's kit and attach this to the arm and use the elbow guard too. The next arm will be the original power fist from Guilliman, so build this up and glue it to the model. For the upper armour panel, we'll be using the claw plate from Abaddon's kit. Once again, smooth off any of the parts, but leaving the skulls on the knuckles behind. The next part is adding some more variant to the front of the leg plates. Since we made the chest piece look more rustic, I wanted the front leg guards to share the same peak. This means we're going to be using the front guards from the Lion's set.
But there's a slight issue. There's only one leg guard in the box.
We could go ahead and make a mould, use the original as a template, and then use some green stuff pressed into a mould to get an exact copy.
And I most certainly didn't waste a day trying this method.
But there was just something about it that did not look right. The end result was just a bit too soft. So what did we do? Well,
We'll just sculpt and 3D print one.
but before we attach these plates on, we'll need to cut the legs to alter their pose, and add 2 brass rods for details on the legs. The armour plates will then be added. As there will be a gap between the front and the back, we'll need to fill these in with some green stuff and then sand these areas down so we have a nice smooth transition on the armour panel. Now it's time to start working on the weapon, and for the first part we're going to be using some brass tubes to make the shaft of the weapon. As for the axe head, this is also a 3D printed piece, far easier than attempting to sculpt the axe head for the 100th time.
Now, the reason why I've chose to use a lot more 3D printed parts here than normal is there's far too many pieces which need to be more precise. The stencils, the moulds, they just weren't getting enough of a sharp edge that I needed. But don't worry, there's still plenty more sculpting to come.
Next we will sculpt some extra details onto the axe, like wrapping the handle to simulate leather, adding the edges, and then attaching skulls to the back. For the shoulders, we will take the shoulders from the Abaddon's kit and add a ridge. Then we'll cut out the bottom part and add another shoulder pad into this void to give us the shoulder step. This is then sanded down to match the same ridge as the upper part of the shoulder. With the first shoulder now done, it's now time to make a copy and duplicate this for the other side. This was done by making a mould, pressing it in and then carving out the shape. Next, it's time to add some details to the body, such as skulls, bones, rags, cuts, dents, and sigils. Now for the final parts, the head and the power pack. Both of these parts were sculpted and printed. We'll add some cables and rivets onto the armour. The rivets were made using a hole puncher and some 1mm ABS sheets. With some delicate touches, these were glued and then put into place. With these now done, let's take a look at how the model looks. With the model primed, we have one task to do before we start putting down some colour. We need to brighten the highest spots first. This is going to help with making the model register brighter. We want to avoid the underside of the model as we'll be adding in the shading last. So I'll be adding the white paint directly from above, making sure I capture everything in a broad stroke. That way we'll have the brightest parts from the top, the red primer showing through the midsection, and then the darker recesses blending together. With the model ready, we're going to be putting down our first colour, using Vallejo Field Blue mixed with Citadel Contrast Black Templars in a 10:1 ratio. This is going to cover the entire model. Just make sure you paint this layer thinly. The next layer is adding pale sands into the colour mix in a 5:1 ratio. We will be placing this on the highest points. After a few passes of very light layers, we should be left with a nice, pale, bland paint scheme, ready to be detailed. Before we can move forward with the armour, I decided to mask the helmet and use Vallejo Gold Brown to paint the first layer of the painted skull. The final layer was pale sands for the highest points of the helmet to give some contrast.
Next for the armour, I used Vallejo grey wash and painted this into all of the shaded areas. I like to use this wash at the end as it's a very translucent paint colour. When it dries, it's very subtle in the colour shifting. It can make certain blends meld much better together. This is how the armour is looking. A simple colour, but it's already got a lot of depth. Now with the primary painting done, let's get this model varnished and start scuffing everything up. The first layer is Streaking Grime. Let it sit for a few minutes until it looks dry. Then I run a saturated weathering brush down the length of the model. You do not need to be precise or careful, you only need to be mindful of just how much you are touching the model. Several streaks are enough to start the process of the streaking. Next, grab a Q-tip and buff off any pooling or areas you'd rather have cleared. Remember, there will be many more layers to come, so it's best to move fast, think fast, and move on to the next layer. You can always add more detail in the next layer. After another varnish layer, it's time to add a thicker layer of Streaking Grime. This time, I'm more selected into where I want to place this. Once it dries, it's the same process all over again. Streak, swab, and clear what you don't want left behind. One thing I started to do in this layer is I started to manipulate the Streaking Grime to create larger, thicker streaks. This is done by adding blobs of grime into an area, then running a brush saturated down the sides of the paint, eventually connecting at the bottom to create a streak. This process is repeated as many times as you feel you need. There is no right or wrong amount. Just keep going until you are happy with the depth and detail that you've created. Here is how the model is looking before we continue. Nice, dusty and grimy. A great space for adding some more weathering. So let's get to adding some rusts. For this step, I'm using Abteilung 502 light rusts. This is applied in the same way as we did before. Apply selectively, let it dry, swipe and move the paint into your desired pattern. I'm mostly targeting the protruding parts of the armour, the rivets, joints, and especially the lower portions, as this is where the collection of the dirt and grime will most likely be. Now that it's dry, it's time for the cleanup. With the rust mostly done, I added some extra detail by mimicking dents, nicks and some scratches along the armour. So, using the original armour paint's colour, I added some small dots and streaks in random patterns. Next, I used a sponge and applied Rhinox hide over the rusted areas to add even more depth. Just be careful not to overdo it, or to apply too much of this colour. Once I was happy with the sponge, I applied some extra dots with a paintbrush just to finalise some of the shapes. After a quick seal, it's time for the light rusts again. Now this is no joke. There is an abundance of layers upon layers at this point here, but there is reason for why we do for the layers. The more layers that we have, the more depth that we can add into the colouring. Just take a look here. Just look at the depth of all the colours, look how it's registering with one another, look how much layers of the detail that we can put in through to the rust. It does take a lot of time, but it's very rewarding. The more you put into this now, the more detail you're going to get at the end. Now that the armour is done, I then based all of the other pieces and started moving onto the skulls dotted all over the model. I layered up several coats of Seraphim Sepia until the bones were a nice rich brown colour, and then dry brushed the original colour over the top to capture the highest points on the bones. Then to start bringing out the colour of the bones, I started to add pale sands into the mix and selecting the higher points of the bones. The next treatment is painting all of the metal parts. That's the vents, rivets, and the axe head. This was done using true metal steel. These parts were again given the same treatment as the rest of the model, so that means oils, varnishes, and lots of spirits. To give the model some firepower, I gave the plasma pistol on his hand some OSL, painting a white base first and then adding magenta over. With the model coming closer to being complete, I created a quick base from cork, dirt and glue, making layers and sealing everything in PVA. After a quick coat of paint and some clever colour placing, I glued the model on and set everything into place. At this point, I decided I wasn't happy with how one of the shoulders had developed. It seemed too empty for the style of the model. So I decided to add some flayed flesh and skulls attached by chains and ropes. For the final addition to the model, I wanted to bring the axe into the future, showing it coursing with power and potentially being corrupted. So I used copper wire and bent them into jagged lines to simulate sparks. These sparks were given the same treatment as the plasma pistol, based in white, painted magenta, and then highlighted with yellow. With the final part coming to an end, let's see how this model turned out.